at the 19th century, which means we're slowing down a little bit in the speed at which we're covering church history. And part of the reason for that is that the 19th century is a particularly important, a particularly rich, a particularly influential, a particularly challenging century for the Church of Jesus Christ. It's also, as one scholar put it, the great century. It's a great century because it saw remarkable growth in the Church of Christ. The 19th century was a great missionary century. And so we're going to be looking at a century in which there was great accomplishment as well as great challenge to the church. And the church had to adjust and change and develop in a variety of ways. It's also a century, of course, relatively close to us. Closer to some of us than others, and not immediately in the experience of any of us. But so many things that happened in the 19th century still are very influential on the church today, on the experience of Christians today. And the 19th century is such a rich century that even by spending this whole series looking at the 19th century, we won't be able to cover everything. And so we're going to focus as we go along a little more on America than we probably strictly should. But after all, most of the people who will be seeing this series are attending American churches. And even those who aren't attending American churches are probably attending churches around the world that have been significantly influenced by the American experience, because we've been very good as Americans at exporting our religion. Better at exporting some of our less happy elements of religion than the good elements of our religion. But nonetheless, American church experience has been very influential around the world. And that's why I, with a slightly guilty conscience, justify spending so much time looking at America. We also will look a little more at the Reformed experience beyond the just general Christian experience. We will look more broadly than just the Reformed experience, but we will have a kind of focus on the Reformed experience, partly because that, of course, is what Ligonier Ministries exists to teach and understand and connect to the Bible for us, but also because the Reformed experience has been a particularly important part of the intellectual defense of Christianity in the 19th and 20th centuries. And so some people may feel this is a little too focused just on American and Reformed experience, but I think we can justify that, and whether you think we can justify it or not, that's what we're going to do. So there it is. So here we are at the beginning of the 19th century, and already at the beginning of the 19th century, there was a sense that Christianity's future was problematic. In 1799, a still relatively young German pastor spoke a series of lectures that were later published in the title On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. That's very interesting, that a young preacher would think Christianity so under attack by the intellectual elites in Germany and more broadly in Europe that he decided to try to address that forthrightly with this series of addresses. On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. And that points out an important thing that we'll see as we go along in the 19th and 20th century, that Christianity will remain in many places still strong and influential among what we might call more common people, but with declining influence amongst the power brokers, the intellectual power brokers, the political power brokers. And we don't have to stretch our imaginations very far to understand that, because we see that in our world today, don't we? That vast sections of America are still religious, are still church-going, are still pious, are still Bible-believing, but the cultural elites in America, those who control the universities, those who control public media, these people, by and large, are not interested in that, are not convinced of the importance of that. I was thinking that I suspect there were many more people in church in Florida on Sunday than were in Daytona Beach at the raceway for the Daytona 500. And yet there was no media coverage of church attendance yesterday, but huge media coverage of this auto race. I don't understand auto racing. I won't get into that because I'll get in trouble. But hours of that. Anyway, I don't see how that even makes good video except for the crashes. Anyway, we're going to see this widening gulf as we go through the 19th and 20th century between the culture despisers of Christianity and the continuing influence and presence and vitality of Christianity in many people, both in Europe and in America. But the reality as we're going into the 19th century is that the French Revolution becomes sort of the great event against which much in the 19th century is measured. Late 18th century, the French Revolution, the monarch is overthrown and then guillotined. Terror takes over an effort that initially was an effort to establish democracy, and then the whole thing ends up with Napoleon establishing, in effect, monarchy all over again. But this moment of dramatic change in Europe, this evidencing that not only can a monarchy and a government be overthrown, but many of the elite, the aristocrats, can similarly be executed or exiled, and that an experiment in a whole new way of organizing government and organizing society can be violently introduced. That led Europeans throughout the 19th century to think, are we all headed towards revolution? Would heading towards revolution be a good thing or a bad thing? What kind of government would we actually want, ideally? And you have this very interesting development in the course of the 19th century. In 1804, almost at the beginning of the 19th century, Napoleon has himself crowned as Emperor of France, as Emperor of the Republic of France. Now, you try to explain that to me exactly how that works, how a republic will functionally have an emperor. Of course, it's really not a republic at all. It simply is an imperial monarchy. So the efforts at democracy in France fail in the French Revolution. Napoleon becomes an emperor. By 1848 in Europe, so sort of right in the middle of the century, there are uprisings in various parts of Europe to try to change the old order, to introduce more democracy into European governments. Those uprisings in 1848 largely fail, and as the century wears on, the monarchies of Europe seem actually to be strengthening themselves. At least many of them are, and the German king becomes a German emperor by the 1870s. Queen Victoria is made Empress of India in 1877. I think the British want to keep up. The Germans have an emperor, the French have an emperor, the Austrians have an emperor. We want an emperor. Well, actually, they wanted an empress. And so she's never quite Empress of England or Britain, but she does become Empress of India. And so there's this sort of strengthening of the old order. The Tsar in Russia is an emperor. There's an apparent strengthening of that monarchical principle in Europe. At the same time, there are many voices wanting more democratization. So there's this political struggle going on in Europe, and part of that goes on because there's significant economic changes taking place. Earlier in European history, most people felt you didn't have much opportunity to change the kind of life into which you were born. If you were born an aristocrat, you expected to remain an aristocrat. If you were born a peasant, you expected to remain a peasant. There wasn't much social mobility. There wasn't much opportunity for change because most of wealth was based in the ownership of land and of agriculture. And the aristocrats, by and large, owned the land, and the common people worked on their land to make money for them. And trying to gain enough money to buy somebody else's land was not usually a very easy thing to do. But by the 19th century, things were changing enough in Europe that there were new economic opportunities which would lead to new social and political opportunities. Colonies that European nations were gaining meant money was flowing in from Africa and from Asia, and that meant a new class could grow that, of course, came to be named the middle class. A very clever name for those who are sort of between the aristocrats and the peasants. The growth of cities is where the middle class began to take on its power. Their economic opportunity was not based in the ownership of vast quantities of land, but of involvement in trade in cities. And the colonies helped facilitate that. So did the rise of industry and manufacture in Europe in the 19th century. What comes to be known as the Industrial Revolution, bringing parts of the population from the farms into the cities and giving people more opportunity, and then beginning to think, maybe my betters really aren't better. You know, people really believed for a long time that aristocrats were better than common people. The aristocrats certainly believed that, but they'd convinced a lot of the common people that that was true as well. And one of the interesting things that happens after the French Revolution is that a lot of aristocrats in Europe look around, particularly in England, and they say, those French aristocrats were so arrogant, so cruel to their people, so insensitive to the needs of non-aristocrats, that there was so much hatred against them that was manifested in the French Revolution. We better not behave like that. We better try to convince people that, in fact, as aristocrats, we are moral, maybe more moral. We are sensitive, might be going too far, but we are concerned about the little people. And so there are changes taking place in Europe, political pressures that are beginning maybe to create changes. There are certainly social and economic changes, and all of this has an impact on the church. How will the church relate to these changes? How will the church relate to these cultured despisers? And as I thought about the ways in which the church faced the 19th century, it seemed to me that there were 5 kind of reactions. I was sort of embarrassed by that. Can Calvinists only think in terms of 5s? I mean, I really wanted 4 or 6, but work as I might, it seemed to come out to 5. So there are 5 broad, sometimes overlapping responses to what is happening in Europe in the early 19th century, really throughout the 19th century, in part in response to the French Revolution. One response, of course, is simply to reject the church, to attack the church, to say that the church is simply part of the old order, the church is passé, the church and Christianity are not intellectually defensible. That was the great argument in the French Revolution by the leaders of the revolution. You remember how radical their approach to an attack on Christianity was. They didn't even want a 7-day week. That was too much a reflection of the old order and the Christian notion of time. They wanted a 10-day week. That would be more rational. And so they tried to change everything. It didn't really work. You can't really ultimately rebel against God's order and succeed. You're going to run into some kind of trouble. But that's what we're going to see throughout the 19th century. There will be voices attacking Christianity, rejecting Christianity, and and insisting that Christianity is not only untrue, but Christianity is dangerous. Christianity is bad. We see that in certain arguments today, don't we, about social issues. Christians are depriving people of opportunity and of freedoms that they ought to be able to possess. So that's one kind of response to Christianity that we'll see. Another response, almost the polar opposite response, is the response of wanting to establish Christianity, to enforce it as the legal religion, to punish in law those who go too far attacking Christianity. And a number of the monarchies of Europe did precisely that. They already had rather established churches from earlier times, but all of that was reinforced. And I can remember reading about how composers of operas in the 19th century would have to submit the libretto to a censorship board to decide whether the opera was politically or religiously subversive. And Verdi was not allowed to cover certain historical themes in his operas in Italy, for example, because they were considered dangerous ideas, dangerous to morality, dangerous to religion, dangerous to the established political order. So one of the responses was to try to retrench and insist that Christianity would be protected in law. And there were probably many Christians at the time who thought that was a good idea. Insist that Christianity is the only proper legal religion. For many years in the 19th century, in the British Parliament, at the end of the meeting of Parliament, they would pass a law pardoning anyone who had served in Parliament without being a member of the Church of England. The law said to serve in Parliament, you had to be a member of the Church of England. But gradually, some Roman Catholics were elected and some Jews were elected, and they dealt with that not by disestablishing the Church of England, but just annually sort of forgiving people for having been there. But it was a way of maintaining that this is a Protestant realm. When Queen Elizabeth was crowned in 1952, she still took the coronation oath that she would be the defender of the faith. And that meant defending the Church of England in England. Church of Scotland in Scotland, by the way. But anyway, that we were. So here is one response. Let's entrench the legality of Christianity in law and support that. The danger is, maybe today some of us have a certain almost nostalgic feeling, maybe that would be nice. The danger there is that then Christianity in law and in the public mind becomes attached to the old order. So Christianity now is seen widely as that which the emperor or the king defends. Christianity is the ideological prop of the government. They used to joke that the Church of England was the Tory party at prayer. And that has a danger attached to it, you see. If Christianity is so linked to the political order, it means that those who criticize the political order will also be criticizing Christianity. And we see that very powerfully at the time of the Russian Revolution, for example, in the early 20th century, where the attack on the Tsar and his old order becomes an attack on the Russian Orthodox Church that supported the Tsar. And so that's a second response. Let's establish it and legally commit ourselves to it, but we're going to see there's a danger to that as we go along. A third response is to accommodate to the growing intellectual criticism of Christianity, and to say, well, we think Christianity can go along with some of these modern ideas. We think Christianity can live and let live with a number of the new changes. If you don't think the Bible is a word directly from God, Well, we can accommodate with that and begin to talk about the Bible as having been generally inspired by God, but not particularly inspired by God. Or if you begin to think that human beings are evolved from lower forms of existence, we can just accommodate with that. Special creation at appointed time, first parents, that's not really crucial to Christianity. We can give that up and still talk about the nobility of the human spirit. And so we'll be tracing as we go along some of these accommodations, these efforts to make Christianity more modern, make Christianity more relevant, make Christianity intellectually respectable. And I don't want to give away the whole story, but we'll see that those approaches don't really work very well. But fourth, we'll see that there are in the 19th century strong intellectual defenses of Christianity, Orthodox Christianity, Protestant Orthodox Christianity. And we'll look some at some of the things that went on at Princeton Seminary, which was a great intellectual center of defense of Christianity in the 19th century America. We'll also look at Abraham Kuyper, because you just can't get along very well without looking at Dutch people. And we'll look at the remarkable defense of the faith that Abraham Kuyper presented in the 19th century. So we have Christianity attacked, Christianity established, Christianity accommodated, Christianity defended, and the fifth point is Christianity revived. We'll see in the 19th century a great emphasis that the real way to preserve and advance Christianity is to stress the renewal of the heart, the vitality of Christian religion, the reality of Christian experience, and to work, to pray, to long, and to see the church renewed in a vigorous commitment to Christianity. And that will be particularly true of American experience. America will be, not by any means the only place, but a center for the real vitality of Christianity and its revival. Europeans, to a significant extent, will try to depend on establishing Christianity in law. Americans try to revive Christianity in the hearts of the people. And that proves to be ultimately a much more successful, a much more vital way of preserving, defending, and extending Christianity. So those are some of the things we're going to look at as we go along. We're going to have a lot that we're going to be focusing on, but I hope that kind of introduction will help us put things in categories as we go along, as we look at the more particular ways in which Christianity seeks to function. So that's our introduction. As we come to a close, we want to keep those 5 things in mind. The attack, the establishment, the accommodation, the defense, and the revival of Christianity, because it'll help us think about almost everything we see in the history of the 19th century church. Thank you.
Scripture reading from 1 Corinthians 1:18 says, "For the word of the cross is folly to those that are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." And you see that dynamic at work in what he's talking about here. The people that rejected Christianity declared it to be folly. They were even doing that at the time that the Holy Spirit was billion years apiece. Nobody says how long a day is. It could have been a big, long time period. So that's all accommodation that was watering down the scriptures in Christianity. Let's look at some discussion questions. This might be a fun one. Number 2, what are the similarities of the French Revolution's attack on Christianity and today's attacks on Christianity? What do you think some of the similarities are?
Communist.
What's that? Communistic. Those Greeks were communistic from time to time. Anybody else on that? Any similarities? I mean, how do we attack Christianity today?
I think we still try to accommodate Christianity into the current beliefs.
Okay. There's a guy on the internet that's got all these vestments and, you know, a nice shawl-like thing, and he holds out a Bible and he says, hey, you know, nobody that knew Christ had anything to do with this Bible. You know, let's find all the parts of the Bible where Jesus' friends wrote about him or spoke about him. So the first thing he does is he sets aside the whole Old Testament, and then he claims the New Testament has no accounts from direct witnesses to Christ's life. Well, that's bogus, but you know, he's there and he's got his little website-y thing, and people listen to him, and I'm sure if you want to deny Christianity, you go, oh yeah, I knew it was all a big fake story, fairy tale, myth. So, what's that? I don't know. Joe Biden's still looking for the book.
What about the intellectual challenges?
Yeah.
I think
The intellectual challenges, right? You know, in the New Testament, there's Paul uses a term, he calls it the Gentiles' walk, and you know the Gentiles, they had all the philosophies and you know, Plato and Aristotle and all that kind of intellectual thinking and everything, and I call that the Gentiles' walk, and I say to me, that's about what goes on in any university. It's a bunch of professors professing to be wise, but they're fools because they deny Scripture and the truth of Scripture. So you've got this intellectual cloud that obscures Christianity for so many people, and we see a lot of our youth are swayed by that when they go to a university and they sit in class and they listen to professors hammering away at things that aren't even part of the subject matter that they're supposed to teach on. What's that?
The term progressive.
Progressive, baby. Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about one of the guys that Dr. Godfrey mentioned. And this individual, he said this: no single piece of our mental world is to be sealed off from the rest, and there is not a square inch in the whole domain of human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. Now, does that sound like a two-kingdom guy? Not at all. You know who said that? It's Abraham Kuyper. And Abraham Kuyper, his name front-loaded on that, but this guy was busy. He was very busy. He founded a university. He founded a political party called the Anti-Revolutionary Party. He started a newspaper called The Standard. He was a pastor, and he worked within the Dutch Reformed Church. He was trying to help that church adapt to loss of state financial aid. He was trying to address Arminian religious revivals and so on. He was very much opposed to modernism in theology. You know, it sounds like Machen wrote against modernism. So he's a very interesting fellow. He was born in 1837, so he covered a lot of the 19th century as he was growing up. He was homeschooled by his father, and then he went off to university and he studied lots of things, literature, philosophy, theology. He received a degree in 1857, summa cum laude. He got a philosophy degree a year later, also summa cum laude. He took classes in Arabic, Armenian, and physics. So I thought, what are Armenian? No, Armenian. So he took classes in those. He received a doctorate in theology. He wrote a dissertation about Calvin and another individual named John Lasky. He also changed views during his lifetime. So he had a modern tendency early when he was younger, and then he stepped back from that as he got older and had more wisdom. So he entered the ministry. He was 25 years old. He went to pastor a church in a small town. He had 5 sons, 3 daughters, and he began to become more and more orthodox during this time period, and he sympathized with the orthodox tendency within the Dutch Reformed Church. So there's probably some division, not unlike in the Presbyterian Church in America, where there's an orthodox group and there's a liberal, maybe progressive group, and they're starting to kind of pull against each other. He was opposed to centralization of the church. That would be kind of like Church of England, very centralized. He was opposed to that. He was opposed to the role of the king in the church, and he pushed for separation of church and state. And his newspaper was used to advance some of his views, and he ended up in 1886, he led an exodus out of the Dutch Reformed Church because he was grieved that Reformed distinctives within what was the state church in the Netherlands, they weren't required anymore for office bearers to agree to Reformed standards that used to be foundational. So, that would be like the OPC saying that, well, you can become an officer, but you don't need to support the Westminster Confession of Faith, and you don't need to believe this, you don't need to believe that. Maybe even you can say, well, there's some things in the Bible that aren't really the literal Word of God. So he was very troubled by that, and so he led this exodus, and he believed that ministers and church members needed to subscribe to the Reformed confessions. So he was suspended from the church. He didn't want to accept So he